Pursuant to the order of June 12, 2025, I leave the chair for the Senate to resolve into a committee of the whole to consider the subject matter of Bill C-5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. The Honourable Senator Cormier will chair the committee. The chamber is suspended.
Honourable Senators, the Senate is resolved into a committee of the whole to continue its study of the subject matter of Bill C-5, an act to enact the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act and the Building Canada Act. Honourable Senators, in the committee of the whole, Senators shall address the chair but need not stand. Under the rules, the speaking time is 10 minutes, including questions and answers, but as ordered, if a senator does not use all of their time, the ballots can be yielded to another senator. Since I will be the timekeeper, senators, I appreciate that you will respect the time. For example, if you're 3 senators in a 10-minute block, it means you have 3 minutes and 20 seconds each. So thank you for respecting the time. The list of all currently confirmed witnesses for the Committee of the Whole on the subject matter of Bill C-5 today was distributed to senators electronically with the scroll notes, and the pages can provide senators with that list upon request.
The committee will first welcome the Honourable Dominic Leblanc, PC MP, Minister responsible for Canada-US Trade, Intergovernmental Affairs, and One Canadian Economy, and the Honourable Rebecca Alty, PC MP, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. I would now invite them to enter, accompanied by their officials.
Ministers, welcome to the Senate. I would ask you to introduce your officials and to make your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes each.
Don't start your clock right away, Chair.
So, Mr. Chair, honourable senators, thank you for the invitation. I see you introduced my new colleague, somebody I worked with when she was mayor of Yellowknife, and for her, this is, I think, her first appearance before a committee of the whole of the Senate, so thank you for having us. Monsieur le Président, je suis accompagné.
Mr. Speaker, I am accompanied by the Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council, Christiane Fox, also Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, Sarah Jackson, and Daniel Marin, also from the Privy Council office.
Si vous me permettez.
If you'll allow, Chair, I will begin. Thank you, as I've said, for welcoming me as chair of the Committee of the Whole, a fellow New Brunswicker. I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to underscore a very important moment for me personally.
Gold closely for a number of years. I chair the Government Operations Committee of Cabinet, where Senator Gold is a standing invitee and participates in those conversations. And Senator, you have made an enormous contribution to Canada with your service in this place. You look 54 years old, but you're actually 74 years old. And Senator Gold will, as you know, colleagues, be leaving this chamber, but not without having made an enormous contribution to our country. And I just wanted to identify that, Senator, before we begin. secret tantôt, sénateur.
The secret, Senator, is that we have a cake awaiting for you. Honorable Senators, I'm here today to speak about the importance of moving C-5 forward and to favor the approach that we have foreseen through this bill. It is an approach that will allow us to take advantage of an opportunity that will make Canada a more prosperous and more sovereign country. Our country is at a turning point. The choices that we make today will determine our economic future. American tariffs are threatening our workers, our industries, and our sovereignty. The world is increasingly unstable. I've just arrived from Calgary this morning. I was at the G7 meeting, and the Prime Minister met Mr. Trump yesterday. In this new context, Canadians expect their government to act decisively to protect our national interests. They expect that we leave behind our old ways of doing things and that we rise to the occasion, rise to the task before us in a spirit of solidarity and determination.
Canada is to emerge stronger from this moment. We need to give ourselves the ability to connect our resources, our people, and our ambition from one coast to another, and out to the world. Building transmission lines, ports, rail lines, and energy infrastructure is about creating possibilities for every region of the country and for all our people. It's about enabling our entrepreneurs, farmers, manufacturers, and workers to compete, innovate, and to succeed at home and globally as well. This is a time when the national interest calls for the federal government to step up, to catalyze investment and accelerate the federal approvals for projects that are of national significance in the national interest. And Bill C-5 is our response to this hinge moment. It enables the kind of nation-building initiatives that will power our economy, drive greater trade, and secure our future. And we will do this in a way that aligns with our values and responsibilities as a country. We will work together with provinces and territories, advance reconciliation through the economic participation of Indigenous peoples, and ensure the continued protection of our environment. This determination to work in lockstep with provinces, territories, and Indigenous peoples to get big things done was recently echoed in the discussions at which I was present with all of Canada's First Ministers in Saskatoon 2 weeks ago. On June 2nd, premiers from every political stripe expressed enthusiastic support about the potential that this approach represents. The time has come for us to do away with some traditional delays and focus our collective energy in delivering for Canadians. We believe Bill C-5 gives us an opportunity to do that. To that end, our government will establish a major federal projects office that will act as a single point of contact and coordination for proponents. The Prime Minister and his government have been very clear about our objectives. We are steadfast in our determination to position Canada as an energy and natural resources superpower. We will not only export raw materials, we will unlock value-added processing and innovation. Je vois, Monsieur le Président, que moi je voulais dire des bonnes choses à propos.
I can see, Mr. Chair, we've lost time because of my comments about Mr. Gold, but this is a project of national unity, and my colleague will speak of the major aspects of this bill. I'm eager to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. I'll begin by recognizing staff that are joining me today. We've got Rob Wright, Georgina Lloyd, and Bruno Steinke. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm pleased to be here today in support of the One Economy Act, legislation that reflects our government's strong commitment to building Canada strong. This bill lays the foundation for one Canadian economy, an economy that works for all Canadians, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Minister Leblanc has outlined the substance of the bill, and I'll focus on how this legislation will be implemented with Indigenous peoples. First off, let me be absolutely clear. Major projects will only proceed under this Act with meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples whose Section 35 rights may be affected. Cette loi exige une consultation significative avec les peuples.
This law requires meaningful consultation with Indigenous peoples, first through the designation of national interest projects, and then when the conditions are set to accompany these projects.
Not optional. It's protected under the Canadian Constitution and embedded throughout the legislation. Thanks to the efforts of Indigenous leaders, governments, and representative organizations, and the important work done in this chamber, Bill S-13 passed last year, which amended the Interpretation Act to ensure that all legislation, including new legislation like the One Economy Act, is interpreted in a way that upholds and does not diminish the Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed in Section 35 of the Constitution. Je tiens à remercier les sénateurs de ce.
I would like to thank the senators in this chamber for their work, which has allowed this bill to be passed. It is important to note that this bill provides for specific provisions on consultations.
Legal obligations under the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, as well as our modern treaties and self-government agreements, to ensure that the duty to consult and accommodate is honored and honored in full. As we undertake this nation-building effort, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent must and will guide every project. As mentioned, this legislation mandates that there must be meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples during both the process of determining which projects are in the national interest and the development of the rigorous conditions for each project. In determining which projects proposed by Indigenous peoples, provinces, and territories are in the national interest, we'll be evaluating based on whether they, A, strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, B, provide economic or other benefits to Canada, C, have a high likelihood of successful execution, D, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples, and E, contribute to clean growth and to meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. The legislation is incentivizing early engagement with Indigenous peoples. Proponents who don't engage with Indigenous peoples before bringing their projects forward for consideration under the legislation will be given a lower evaluation. The intent of the legislation is to streamline the approvals process to advance major projects. We know that failing to uphold our legal responsibilities around consultation and accommodation will only lead to costly and time-consuming delays in courts. This legislation is about supporting projects that are not only shovel-ready, but shovel-worthy. Projects that respect Indigenous knowledge and uphold Aboriginal and treaty rights. We'll be looking for projects that have Indigenous support and, even better, Indigenous equity in the project. Pour bien faire les choses, le nouveau processus prévu dans...
To do things well, the new process provided for in this bill will see the founding of a major projects office, which will bring together all the ministers to set up a unique set of conditions to allow projects to go ahead. There will be an Indigenous advisory committee as part of this office.
Participation in this new process from start to finish. At the same time, being a reliable partner to Indigenous peoples is not just about upholding the duty to consult and accommodate. Enabling the creation of long-term wealth and prosperity for Indigenous peoples through equity ownership is central to building Canada strong. That's why we doubled the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program from $5 billion to $10 billion, enabling more Indigenous communities to become owners of major projects. Just this year, 36 First Nations in British Columbia used this program to secure a 12.5% equity share in a major pipeline, generating long-term income and economic power for their communities. En vérité, notre économie ne peut pas être forte que lorsqu'elle profite à tout le monde.
Quite honestly, our economy only prospers when it benefits everyone. What's good for Indigenous people is good for the entire country.
Begin the vital work of building Canada's future economy, one that includes and is built with Indigenous people. Thank you, merci, Masicho.
Thank you, Minister Alty. Nous allons maintenant passer à la période de questions.
We'll now go to the question period. We have a very long list of senators who wish to speak. Madam Minister and Minister, I inform you respectfully that we would appreciate concise answers to our questions. We've taken note of this aggressive attitude.
Thank you. So the first block of 10-minute questions will go to the opposition. The floor is yours, Senator Ousakos.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ministers, for being here with us today. Ministers, this bill gives unprecedented power to a single minister to decide which projects are of national interest, granting them fast-track approvals. But if the minister refuses, perhaps for ideological reasons, to give that designation, the project defaults to the old, slow regime your government admits is not working. So what happens if the minister is someone, for example, like the Honourable Stéphane Guilbeault, known for opposing oil and gas inherently? Doesn't this bill risk enabling political motivated decisions that quietly block strategic projects and harm the Canadian objective?
Mr. Chair, I'll perhaps, Senator Ousakos, through the chair to you. Thank you for the question. We think that this bill strikes the right balance in terms of providing proponents, if they're Indigenous governments, if they're provincial and territorial governments, we hope many private sector proponents, with greater certainty and greater investor confidence in a process that will lead to an approval from the Government of Canada, obviously with the appropriate conditions around those approvals and done in an expedited way. The hypothetical, you chose a Liberal MP, you gave him a new cabinet job, and you want me to comment on that. Well, Senator Ousakos, I'm not going to do that. The good news for you, sir, is for the moment, I will be the minister responsible for those decisions. And we've known each other for a long time. I'm not an ideological person. I'm pragmatic. And I believe very much that the moment in our country's history lends itself to this kind of expedited, balanced, and thoughtful process. And it's in that spirit that I would seek to exercise that authority, should this legislation, of course, be adopted.
Minister, I'm not talking about this moment. I'm talking about a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not talking about just any random member of parliament. I'm talking about your political minister from Quebec, who has a track record of being excessively radical when it comes to putting up roadblocks in energy development in this country. So I think it's a valid question that the Prime Minister and his objectives, and you and your objectives, have to be aligned with all cabinet ministers, especially those who aren't, if you listen to what they've been saying in the media. So my question is the following. There are currently 28 projects related to energy and critical minerals stalled in the federal approval process. So my simple question is, why not accelerate them immediately if we're facing such an existential crisis?
So through you, Mr. Chair, to Senator Ousakos, the very objective of this bill is to provide that expedited process that would apply to projects that the governor in council, the cabinet, would decide to designate as being in the national interest. So I can't speak to a list of projects that are at different approval processes, but if, for example, one of those proponents, as my colleague mentioned, benefiting from, for example, Indigenous equity participation, the support of provincial and territorial governments, were to decide to ask our government to consider designating one of those projects, then hypothetically, and it's politicians shouldn't answer hypothetical questions, but you asked two or three, so I'll answer one of them. It is conceivable that one of those projects, for example, could be put to the government as being in the national interest. The First Minister's meeting in Saskatoon gave us an opportunity to hear from all of the premiers about a vast list of really interesting projects that they are hoping to work on, in many cases a number of jurisdictions together. So I'm very encouraged, you'll forgive the pun, that the pipeline of projects may offer us a real opportunity to do something important in the national interest.
Look, Minister, you know that we are giving the government the benefit of the doubt. We support this bill in the other House. We're going to support this bill in this place. But we do have some concerns. The responsibilities entrusted to the designated minister are extensive. Centralized authorization, interdepartmental coordination, Indigenous consultation, power to amend project conditions. You're asking us to quickly adopt this bill, but you have not been able to provide a clear budget envelope for this new office. So tell us, frankly, what is the planned budget for this single window? How many public servants will staff it? And when will this funding be available? How quickly?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Senator Zakos, very good questions. I know that the Privy Council office is in the process of establishing precisely that office. Obviously, provisional upon the legislation passing. The government hasn't hired people or re-affected public servants or spent money until we see if Parliament adopts this legislation. But I totally share your view in terms of the urgency of the moment and the need to move quickly. And I'm happy to ensure and to commit that the Privy Council office shares through your chair all of the information as we stand up this office. My colleague mentioned a number of commitments we've made to increasing, for example, to $10 billion, a loan guarantee program for Indigenous equity, capacity building in terms of consultation, and perhaps in subsequent questions we can talk about those investments as well. But I totally share your view that the moment is urgent, and I certainly appreciate your colleagues in the other place, the support that they've shown us, and we look forward to working with all senators here as you study this legislation.
Minister, as you can appreciate, those of us have been in this place for a very long time, have seen this movie before. A government comes well-intentioned with an existential crisis. We got to, move in urgency. With urgency, you ask us to speed through a bill as we're doing in this particular instance, but yet we can't get a precise cost in terms of what this new public servant operation is going to cost. And more importantly, we're speeding this bill through quickly without any clear picture of what the administrative capacity that's going to be in place, not only to evaluate the projects, but to actually see them through, to give us like benchmarks as we go through the process, and to give the government benchmarks so at least we can be accountable to the taxpayers and the public. So don't you think we got to ramp up that aspect of this bill?
Mr. Chair, so Senator Sakos, I absolutely share the premise of your question in terms of the importance of transparency around the use of public money. As I say, I think the government is being careful. We hope this legislation can be adopted expeditiously, but once it is, be happy to share and even to ensure that we go above the normal estimates process in a transparent way. Senator, happy to commit that the Privy Council will share their financial planning in terms of that work. One way that we hope to control some of the costs, and maybe we can talk about this, Mr. Chair, in other questions, but is the ability to have one project, one review, and to benefit from a lot of the good work that's done at provincial and territorial level, orders of government. So, for example, Senator, in your province of Quebec, le BAP does a lot of good work. If we're able to quickly sign agreements with provinces and territories to avoid duplication, overlapping requirements, we think it's in the interest of investors and expeditious project approvals, but it's also in the interest of taxpayers, both at the provincial order of government and the federal order of government. If we can have one project and one review, that's in the best interest of there's only one taxpayer in the country. We think that would also be effective from a financial management point of view, but clearly in terms of expediting as well.
Une dernière question, Monsieur le Ministre, vite.
One last quick question, Minister. Prime Minister Carney has stated that we need national consensus to build a pipeline. Can you tell us in concrete terms what that means exactly? What is that consensus, and what will happen if a provincial premier says no? Answer, you're quite right. I was with Prime Minister Carney when he was asked that question. Obviously, this bill is not before you and before Parliament for us to be able to impose any project, whether that be onto Indigenous peoples or a province or whomever. I was quite encouraged by the consensus amongst the premiers, whether that be the Manitoba NDP premier, as well as the private comments I heard, and Mr. Legault's private and public comments, your premier, as to the importance to be being open to projects that are going to reinforce our economy's productivity and ensure that we are not dependent on a single market for our products. But you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to define in specific terms. Everyone has their own theories, but we are clearly not going to be imposing a project on a province or territory. This may be a way to build this consensus in a more effective way.
We will now move on to the second block of 10-minute questions. It will go to the independent senators group. So the time will be shared between Senator Hébert, Simons, and Galvez. Senator Hébert, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président intérimaire.
Thank you, Pro-Tempore Speaker. Minister, hello. You mentioned that this project is a project that's very important for our country's economic prosperity. We're going through a very turbulent zone, and we're all feeling a little nauseous. So tenders will be following, or maybe even leading the parade, and allowed to encourage Canadian businesses and truly help them. So another challenge is that of labor. We know that to build infrastructure requires workers, many workers, and part of the answer is found in the labor force mobility portion of the bill. But another part is related to immigration. How is the government going to align the goals of those five with the immigration policies that will most likely affect strategic sectors that are greatly affected by these issues? Thank you. Through the chair, thank you, Senator, for the question. And you're absolutely right. Tenders, investments, private investment, possible investments by various levels of government will only attain the economic goals that we've set. You're absolutely right. If we can truly build these national interest projects that we've designated. You're quite right. And I know that Ms. Freeland was here yesterday. The provinces have done a great deal of work together in order to improve the mobility of the labor and workforce mobility. But I'm thinking of my own province. I'm thinking of New Brunswick, where there are increased programs to train young people in trades, in the community colleges, in public schools. This is one provincial government that's decided to take matters in hand. But you're right, immigration is also a part of that challenge. If provinces and territories are enthusiastic about working with us, they also have their own provincial nominee program to designate certain categories of immigration in order to be able to better reach, gain access to that workforce. So we want to ensure that this won't become an obstacle to the goal that you described so well.
Thank you very much, ministers. I worked very closely on Bill C-69 when I first joined the Senate, and I know at the time there was very much a philosophy that the bill was looking for reasons not to build things rather than to build things. So I appreciate the wish to move from the whether to the how. But I can't help but feel we may have overcorrected. And one of the things that concerns me about Bill C-5 is that it front-end loads the consultation period. So you are asking for the consultation before something is designated a project of national importance, a pony, as I like to call them. But the environmental assessment will happen after that consultation. And so I wonder what happens in a case where there's been consultation with provinces, with municipalities, with First Nations, with other stakeholders. There's been a sense of agreement, and then the environmental assessment turns out that this project could have a detrimental impact on nesting sites or breeding grounds or other sorts of, groundwater supplies. And I fear that by putting the cart before the horse, you've gotten the agreement before you've gotten the information. And I wondered if each of you could respond to that.
Rebecca, do you want to start?
Yeah, I do think it's important with this bill. It is that two-step process. So the first step is about engaging with the Indigenous rights holders to determine whether the project should be added to Schedule 1. And then it is moving into the conditions. And so that's that second round of consultation as well as the environmental assessments. And it's through that second part that there will be those conditions added, and the proponents will have to adhere to them. And so I think it is important understanding that two-step process. And again, it is continuing upholding the Constitution and the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The other thing is the part outside of this bill about the capacity building and providing funding to Indigenous rights holders from start to finish of the process. And so that was something that we heard, or the department heard in engagement on consultation last year, was the need for that continuous funding and not application-based, so that Indigenous rights holders are able to effectively participate in the whole process. So it is important, the two parts consultation, and then those conditions would be added to the final document for the minister's approval.
Minister LeBlanc, then let me turn to you. Adding conditions presupposes that the project is going to be approved. What I'm concerned about is that we're designating the projects of national importance before the environmental assessment.
So, Senator, thank you for that question. As my colleague described, it's deliberately designed to have this two-step process. We are confident, having spoken to a number of premiers since the First Minister's meeting. I sat with Premier Smith in Calgary at the Governor General's dinner last evening. There is a great deal of enthusiasm from all First Ministers, obviously if the legislation passes, to start to define what might be projects for the government to designate, as Rebecca indicated. But fully conscious, your question, I think, Senator, is important. I wouldn't want people to have an impression that the project, the environmental assessments, our responsibility under various statutes, the Fisheries Act, the Species at Risk Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and those are just a few, but the list is imposing and appropriate in terms of the government's responsibility to ensure that those assessments are rigorous. And all of those assessments would feed into the conditions document, which would constitute the approval. And I think we should be clear, because there's a designation, that does not mean an automatic approval or the issuance of a conditions document. Again, I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do, but hypothetically, if as we work through a project, in the Department of the Environment, Fisheries and Oceans, providing advice, working with the proponent, if we concluded that the proponent was unwilling or unable to meet the reasonable conditions that we worked on together, then that project might not receive the final approval from the government. So I think it's important to understand that those environmental assessments will absolutely form part of the conditions document that we hope will be the approval.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. Senator Galvez.
Thank you, Ministers, for your presence today here. Most of the witnesses have told us that this bill is an answer to the situation with respect to what is going on in the South and the tariff. Bill C-5 gives the Governor of Council the ability to exempt a national interest project for the application of important laws that protect the environment, such as my colleague and you mentioned Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act, and the Species at Risk Act. Can you tell me that if any other federal law gives this much power to the executive, and if this has a beginning date and end date because the threat in the South is not going to be there forever?
So, Mr. Chair, thank you, Senator, for the question. There were two or three, I think, very, very good questions in what you just posed. In terms of a time period, we're proposing that the ability for the Governor and Council, the Cabinet, to designate a project as being in the national interest would expire, would not exceed 5 years. A 5-year period. The reason is because some projects, let's say in year 2 or year 3, a project was proposed, a province or territory brought forward a project, an Indigenous-led project came to the government. If in a maximum of 2 years we were working on those conditions, we think that that is a reasonable time frame in light of the economic threat that the country faces from the United States, from our neighbors to the south. You said it, Senator, as I say, I participated in the Prime Minister's bilateral with President Trump yesterday in Kananaskis. I'm talking to the U.S. Trade Representative again later this week. Whatever the ultimate deal or arrangement that Canada comes to, we hope to remove all of the tariffs that the United States have imposed illegally and inappropriately on Canada. The economic uncertainty and instability is not going to disappear right away. What President Trump has done, and the Prime Minister has said this in the election campaign, is he's seeking to redefine many of the modern global trading relationships. I met the Mexican Minister of the Economy, Minister Ebrard, yesterday afternoon in Calgary. And we talked exactly about the trilateral context. He's in Washington almost every week. And he tells me that this is not a short-term challenge to the global economy. So that's why we think the time frame is appropriate. And I know, Senator, your chair is, I saw Minister Freeland, Mr. Chair. I won't do that. But with respect to the power given to the Governor and Council, I'm sure that your colleagues might give us an opportunity to address that.
Thank you, Minister. I just want to remind the honorable senators that when you're sharing your time, you have 10 minutes. So 10 minutes altogether, the three of you, with the questions and answers. Thank you. So the third block goes to the Canadian Senators Group. Senator Aucoin and Osler will share the time. Senator Aucoin. Senator Aucoin.
Merci. Bonjour.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ministers and Minister Leblanc. My question is for you, Mr. Leblanc. One of the recurring obstacles in workforce mobility remains the recognition of professional qualifications from one province to another. Given the importance of community colleges like Nova Scotia Community College in Nova Scotia, what commitment is the government making in this bill to harmonize training standards and ensure the quick and fair recognition of qualifications, particularly for newcomers and recent graduates? Mr. Chair, through you, Senator Aucoin, thank you for the question. Well, we don't have a way as a federal government to impose or harmonize, as you know, the standards that provinces decide on in their own jurisdictions. For some trades, I fully agree with you. Community colleges in your province and in mine do significant work. They do important work. What we are trying to do is work with the provinces and the territories so that they themselves decide to harmonize. worker mobility. I'm very encouraged. One of the examples that I used with the premiers in the Atlantic region, for example, the 4 premiers decided to strike a partnership for health workers to recognize that if you're a occupational therapist in Moncton, you want to work in Cheticamp, you can work in there or in Summerside in Prince Edward Island. It was for us an inspiration. Other provinces are trying to replicate or act along the same lines. We as the federal government, and I'm convinced that Ms. Freeland told you about this yesterday, we will remove the barriers on the federal side, and we will work, incentivize, encourage, and support our friends in the provinces and territories who are saying publicly and privately that they fully agree with the challenge that you have just described. Thank you. I have a second question that affects me more personally. Part 2 of Bill C-5 in particular, Section 21, raises serious concerns about the protection of language rights in the workplace. Furthermore, the SNIB said that they were concerned about this section. My fear is that there is the possibility that people will be able to sidestep the Official Languages Act and the use of French within private companies under federal jurisdiction. For example, investors in federal projects in a majoritarily French region could evade the linguistic requirements set out in the Official Languages Act. How does the federal government intend to address this concern for workers in New Brunswick, Acadia, Quebec, and members of the Francophonie across Canada? Mr. Chair and Senator Aucoin, I completely share the concern that you just raised. In your question, you used a hypothetical example that one of the conditions that someone promoting a project might be exempt from linguistic requirements under the Official Languages Act or the French in the workplace in industries under the federal government. I cannot imagine. I would not approve such a condition. To come back to Senator Houssakos' question, as long as I am lucky enough to be the designated minister, if the bill is passed, I would not accept such a condition. So I think that you and I recognize that the application of that circumstance, well, as long as I'm the minister responsible, will not see the light of day. However, you are quite right to raise a concern that under a different government, in a different scenario, is it possible that the bill could be used to weaken linguistic obligations? I cannot imagine such a circumstance. When we discussed it during the election campaign, both with Mr. Carney and the premiers of the provinces, the urgency to take action is real, we believe. But at no time did we imagine that that scenario would be reasonable, and I will work with you and other colleagues to ensure that this concern does not materialize, because I completely share your concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, ministers and your team, for being with us here today. My question is to you, Mr. Leblanc. Given your role as minister responsible for Canada-US trade, do you foresee this bill being a point of tension or cooperation in our cross-border economic relationship, particularly where provincial preferences may diverge from federal priorities?
Mr. Chair, through you, Senator, thank you for the question. I want to make sure I understood. You started off on the Canada-US context And a point of contention, you mean with our friends in the United States, and then
Both.
But then you went to a. Can I ask you? I just want to make sure I understood your question.
Yeah, just on both points of tension between or cooperation on both fronts among our provinces, with our provinces as well as across the board.
So, Senator, I think you've identified precisely a very important opportunity for collaboration at both the federal, provincial, territorial level, and with respect to our most important economic partner, the United States. Geography, the United States is Canada's most important security and economic partner, and will be for a very long time. We're redefining our ability to have a reliable trading relationship. That's a separate subject. But in my conversations with Secretary Lutnick, with Ambassador Greer, as recently as yesterday in Kananaskis, Secretary Besant, the United States Treasury Secretary, was there, and in the President's conversation with the Prime Minister, we're talking about redefining a relationship with the United States, an economic partnership that would include Canada's ability to do major projects. For example, think of the critical mineral space. Premier Smith was speaking to me last night, Premier Moe in Saskatchewan, about potential mineral projects, mining projects that would answer very much the challenge we have not only with the United States but other allies in terms of our dependency on countries like China or Russia. The South African minister was sitting next to me at the dinner last night and talking about Canada and South Africa in terms of being critical mineral giants and what that could mean to global security if we do that properly. So I think there's a big opportunity done properly in the Canada-US relationship. And just going by, Senator, the conversations with premiers in Saskatoon, if you think that all 13 provincial and territorial governments arrived at the meeting with examples of the kinds of projects that they hoped could be developed to the point that the government would consider them, as Rebecca said, for that designation. And many provinces and territories are working together. So if you take the western provinces with the territorial, the northern premiers, they're seeking, the Atlantic premiers are working together. So and the government of Canada is committing to one project, one review, to no duplication, no overlap, to working with them to expedite the projects. I think therein lies a huge opportunity for our federation as well, and I'm quite encouraged. I think all Canadians should be by the action we're seeing from provinces and territories and their leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. You have 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Just want to ask Mr. Leblanc whether Building Canada, whether you have any concerns that streamlining approval for major projects under the Building Canada Act could be challenged by the U.S. as inconsistent with trade obligations under the CUSMA. How is this being addressed as well?
So the short answer is I don't, Senator, have any concerns. I think if we want to strengthen our economic relationship with the United States, our ability to build big projects in Canada and increase the GDP of our country will be a positive element in our relationship with the United States. They certainly haven't raised any concern with me, but they talk to me about big projects that perhaps we could do jointly with United States investors, for example. So that will be a work in progress.
Minister. Senator Klein and Senator Francis from the Progressive Senators Group will share the next 10-minute block. So, Senator Klein.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, ministers. Yesterday, we heard from the National Indigenous leaders that there's been rushed and insufficient consultation on Part 2 of Bill C-5. So I want to thank you for your recognizing the consultation and FPIC in your opening remarks. You're recognizing with conviction duty to consult. UNDRIP law, and Section 35. Ministers, yesterday we heard from national Indigenous leaders also, Minister, we've heard about a so-called Henry VIII clause contained in sections 21, 22, 23, and Part 2 of this bill. Purportedly, these clauses give Cabinet unconstrained ability to alter the operation of virtually all laws passed by Parliament. Minister, if environmental and Indigenous rights statutes can be exempted, what might that mean for the environment and Indigenous people?
Minister.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Yes, as outlined in my opening comments, consultation is legally required, and it's under the Constitution. And so the rights are affirmed by the Constitution, and the duty to consult and accommodate has been set out in a series of Supreme Court of Canada decisions. So this bill cannot supersede the Constitution. So projects will only be designated following full consultation with affected Indigenous rights holders. And I will possibly leave it at that so that I can leave you more time in your 10-minute questions. But it is, the key is that the Constitution, the duty to consult and accommodate is in the Constitution, as well as the amended Interpretation Act that this bill has to follow.
So Henry VIII clause has no impact?
Correct.
Thank you.
Senator Francis.
Welcome, Minister. Ministers, if a project causes serious and unanticipated harm after it has been approved, it is critical that Indigenous peoples and other affected communities have meaningful opportunities for redress. Even before that, however, there must be strong procedural safeguards to ensure that the delegated minister will not abuse the sweeping powers he is granted under this bill. Currently, Bill C-5 would allow him or her to override existing federal laws and regulations, including potentially the Indian Act. Could you explain why the Indian Act has been included in Schedule 2 of Bill C-5, and should First Nations be concerned that a current or future government may override the provisions of the Indian Act that deal with their land rights?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the question. So when moving forward with projects, some communities are subject to archaic provisions under the Indian Act. So we will be engaging with First Nation partners on each project. If we need to suspend some provision of the Act, we will do so in consultation with the First Nation. And just to ensure that the development will respect cultural practices, environmental standards. But one of the things that in discussions with Indigenous leaders was the challenges with the Indian Act when it comes to financial. And so if there is that opportunity to make some provisions to alter that could be considered through this legislation. So again, we want to retain the option for it to advance a project, but it has to be with First Nations. And this legislation, the sections of the Indian Act, again, that's why we decided to include it.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Le prochain bloc ira au...
The next block will go to the Independent Senators group. The time will be shared between Senator Wu, Senator Clément, and Senator Moody. Senator Wu.
Minister, thank you for being here. One of the ways in which this bill supersedes and overrides legislation is in the way it deals with the Statutory Instruments Act. One specific override it has is over the ability of Parliament to review regulations through its Scrutiny of Regulations Committee, which I understand I'll be back on soon enough, and which I had the honor of chairing the last two parliaments. I understand that the need to perhaps override certain statutes in the interest of speeding up an approval process. But the scrutiny job happens well after a project has been undertaken, well after the bill has been put in place, and it's a way to make sure that regulations are consistent with the law in which we pass. Why was it necessary to take this quite extraordinary step to the Scrutiny Committee?
So, Mr. Chair, through you to Senator Wu, thank you for that question. And I have been hanging around Parliament long enough to know and have colleagues that have served a number of years on the Joint Committee on the Scrutiny of Regulations. And you're absolutely right. It is an example, I think, where where the Senate, this chamber, and the other place work on something that perhaps isn't, as you described, Senator, I think very well, and for Canadians that might be watching us, I think that is an important parliamentary responsibility that has been exercised over a long period of time by both chambers. So I absolutely subscribe to the work that is often done out of the glare of the public light, but contributes, I think, to governments being responsible and the executive branch enacting regulations that, as you described very well, respect the legislation that was adopted by Parliament. So again, I'm doing this the third time I've said what I wouldn't do is think of a hypothetical example. For quatrième fois, sénateur, oof.
For 4 times, Senator? Well, the hour is early. It's not enough questions for my colleague yet.
Sure. Our objective here is to say to proponents of projects, to provinces and territories, to Indigenous proponents, that we're prepared to act and act swiftly and responsibly in a balanced way. But I would be happy to work with that committee and others to ensure that to not use the hypothetical example of an extreme outcome, but to ensure that is done, obviously, in a responsible way.
Can you think of any other statutory instrument that has been exempt from the review and the purview of the Regs Committee? And even if you don't have the answer, can you find a way to preserve Parliament's right to at least look at the regulations after the fact so that we're not totally in the dark?
So, Mr. Chair, Senator, I'm not aware of other examples, but it doesn't mean there aren't some. It's such a technical point of law, but I'd be happy to ask the Privy Council officials who are here with me to answer that precise question and get you that precise answer. I don't know it myself, but it's a very good question. I'll get you that answer in terms of are there other precedents, and would be happy to work with your committee to ensure, as you said, that the fundamental respect for Parliament is preserved. But, Senators, I want to be transparent. The government believes that to encourage investors to come forward, to encourage provinces and territories to put forward major projects because of the economic and geopolitical urgency of the moment, we want to tell those proponents and their partners, including Indigenous peoples, as my colleague said, that we're prepared to do this work in a responsible, expeditious way, but I wouldn't purport to take away that important role of Parliament, Senator. Thank you for raising that.
Senatrice Clément.
Thank you to both.
Senator Clément.
Minister Alty, you and I have both been mayors, and I've long admired your work when you were dealing with the impact of wildfires on your community. I admired your leadership style. I was on a municipal panel with you, organized by Senator Simons at FCM. Mayors understand relationship building. We see our constituents, our neighbors on the street. They know us by name. And I know that you bring relationship building skills to this job. And you mentioned meaningful consultation in your opening statement. And I want to sort of speak about that, not just in the legal requirement piece, but in the relationship building piece. So in Ontario, communities have been upset by our own Bill 5 here, which was passed. And today, the Chiefs of Ontario have organized a rally right here on Parliament Hill in response to C-5. In fact, former Grand Chief of Akwesasne, now Regional Chief Abram Benedict, spoke just moments ago. In our conversations with them earlier this week, they sent us some of their questions, and I want to relay their concerns here. Given the speed at which Cabinet can move under C-5 with emergency-like power to override legislation and regulation, does the government anticipate repercussions like demonstrations and protests that would result in delaying projects? How more specifically does the government intend to mitigate those risks? What does the government say in response to the Chief of Ontario gathering on the Hill today?
Thank you, Senator, for the questions. I think the point I'll speak on is kind of the idea that this bill is proposing accelerating Indigenous consultation, and what I think is important is the opportunity to streamline, to create that major projects office. And so over the last year, Crown Indigenous Relations has conducted engagement sessions with Indigenous peoples via our existing forums and tables on a proposed Crown consultation coordinator function. And so these sessions revealed several reoccurring concerns related to all federal consultations. And some of the themes were insufficient coordination, difficulty navigating consultation processes, especially for smaller communities with limited capacity, fragmented and inadequate funding for participation in consultations, and growing consultation fatigue exacerbated by overlapping and duplicative processes. So without new coordinated mechanisms to navigate these complexities, we do risk the judicial reviews of consultation adequacy, delaying projects, and diminishing the confidence in the Crown's ability to lead a fair and effective process. And so that's why I think it's important the establishment of the Major Projects Office that would be leading the work on this legislation, because through the proposed Major Projects Office, we will be centralizing knowledge and tracking of consultation activities, developing a centralized approach to identifying impacted Indigenous communities to consult, clearly identifying rights holders early in the process to reduce uncertainty and avoid delays in project timelines, serving as a point of contact for escalating consultation issues and ensuring timely access to senior decision makers, and providing project-specific information on asserted or established Aboriginal and treaty rights, including unresolved or historic claims within project corridors, as well as providing project-specific information on modern treaty and self-government agreement obligations and commitments within project corridors.
Minister, thank you, Minister. Senator Moody, I'm sorry to have. Senator Moody.
Thank you, Chair. Ministers, welcome, especially to you, Minister Alty, on your first time here in the Senate. Minister LeBlanc, one of the reasons that barriers to interprovincial trade have developed over time has been regional protectionism. Although our economy should be top of mind, we know that our culture, our communities, our economies are all tied together. No Canadian wants to see communities suffer because jobs are moving to other areas of the country. Minister, clarify for us today what efforts are being made working with the provinces and territories to find a healthy balance between protecting smaller, more vulnerable communities while growing and integrating Canada's economy.
Minister.
Senator, Mr. Chair, through you, Senator, thank you for the question. You have identified, I think, the reasons over a number of decades why provincially, territorially, and at the Government of Canada, a series of barriers is a dramatic word, but a series of policies, regulations, requirements have built up over time. A friend of mine in New Brunswick said we just accumulate more snow in front of the plow as we try and build one Canadian economy. And the regional politics, the local politics are very complex. And I've heard premiers of smaller provinces, I'm sure Rebecca, the territorial premiers. You're right, the economy of Nunavut is different than the economy of the province of Ontario. Small provinces like New Brunswick worry that in some circumstances their local economies may be affected. What's encouraging, though, is that experts and analysis from economists, from global institutions and Canadian think tanks have all said that done properly, the removal of these barriers and the creation of one Canadian economy, not 13, to pick up a phrase the Prime Minister used every day in the election campaign, will add up to 4% to Canada's GDP. And that will create jobs in communities all across the country. And to bridge from removing the interprovincial and territorial barriers to the second part of the legislation, the major projects, is many of these projects will bring immediate economic benefit to some of the smaller jurisdictions. So if you think of the Indigenous proponents that are suggesting a potential project at Grays Bay, if you think of the Atlantic provinces coming together with the province of Quebec to do interesting things on an energy partnership, done properly, those national projects will also contribute economic activity. I'm encouraged by the premiers themselves, the business communities, and organizations representing workers asking all governments, every order of government, to do what the moment requires, both in terms of eliminating those interprovincial barriers, but also on national projects that I see your chair is about to apply the Freeland.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. Senator Wallen from the CSG will share her time with Senator Greenwood from the ISG. So you will share the next 10 minutes. Senator Wallen.
Thank you. Mr. LeBlanc, thank you both for being here, but let's just begin with the criticism of this bill in general that we hear from members of your own party on the floor, that this has usurped, your approach to this particular bill has usurped the rights and obligations of parliamentarians. Debate has been stymied in your House. This is not our general procedure here. We would usually send a bill to committee. We would have witnesses. We would take testimony, and we would apply sober second thought to that bill. But because of the time pressures that you've put on, we're now in this particular process. Can you explain why you think this is so necessary at this moment? We've talked a little bit about what the crisis is. I'm not sure that with you and the Prime Minister actively engaged in the trade negotiations and our security and trade relationship with the U.S., that they have, the two leaders have put kind of a 30-day timeline on there. Why would we not subject this legislation, which is so crucial domestically, really not that central to the trade relationship with the U.S. These rules are domestic that we're talking about. Why would you not give this the proper scrutiny that it needs to resolve the critics that are making the case about the powers of declaring a national interest project?
Minister Leblanc.
Merci, Mr. Président, and through you to Senator Wallen. I think the Prime Minister and our government made a compelling case to Canadians that this particular piece of legislation was what the moment required. Every day of the election campaign, the Prime Minister spoke about building big projects in the national interest. It's on page 1 of our election platform. So none of this should surprise Canadians that we think that the country, and that view is shared by all 13 premiers, both before and after the election in meetings that I attended, that the moment has arrived where we have to have an expedited process, not for all projects. And I think, Senator, this is a piece of legislation that applies to domestic law in Canada. It's related only in terms of the discussions with the United States because the economic risk of the United States being an unreliable trading partner means that, again, to pick up a phrase that we used in the election, we have to give ourselves more than somebody else can take away. And we believe that this legislation is urgent in terms of giving that opportunity to build projects in the national interest, not every myriad of project. And that view, I had a discussion last night at dinner in Calgary with the Premier of your province, Senator Wallen, all excited about projects in Saskatchewan that may give that urgent opportunity when he's facing tariff challenges, some with the United States and some obviously with respect to China. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
actually definition from you of what is in the national interest. It seems to be that will be a decision that you, in consultation with the Prime Minister, may make, but there's not a clear set of criteria. And I'm thinking, in this case, in this country, talking about the constitutional rights of the very premiers that to develop resources, to develop oil and gas. And then we have provinces that say they also have the constitutional right to say no to those very projects that might cross their provincial borders. So it comes down to this question, and I know you've been asked this on many other occasions. Will you grant, and I can only use that word because of the powers you've given yourself in this bill, will you grant provinces veto over other projects?
Senator Wallen, you asked two, I think, good questions. The first one is in terms of around the criteria of determining what a project in the national interest might be. We have been quite clear, and it's in the legislation itself, strengthening Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, providing economic and other benefits to Canada, having a high likelihood of successful execution. That picks up a question from your colleague earlier, advancing the interests of Indigenous peoples. That's in the legislation itself, and contributing to clean growth and meeting Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. So there are the 5 criteria in law that we would propose to exercise in terms of that designation. The second part of your question around whether we give a veto to a particular I get that people are looking for absolutes and they want absolute answers to hypothetical questions. I will be governed by what the Prime Minister said in his news conference when we tabled this legislation in the House of Commons, that he does not see a circumstance where the government would impose a project over a province.
Is that a veto?
Well, a veto is the aggressive word you can use. Vetoes, it's a restaurant on Mountain Road in Moncton. Vetoes as well. The former mayor, my university friend, Senator Arnold, knows Vito's restaurant. I think we have to be careful. Senator, if you have 13 premiers coming to us with lists of dozens and dozens of projects, and they're meeting together with each other to come up with ideas of how they can collaborate, it doesn't feel to me like that hypothetical question is one that we're about to cross in the short term.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Greenwood.
Thank you, Minister Alty. Here I am. Thank you for appearing before the Senate today. My question is for Minister Alty. Yesterday, Nitan Obed, president of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, appeared before the Senate and said that Inuit are concerned with the intersection between the rights of Inuit and this proposed legislation, including the risk it creates around the conditions for Inuit Crown treaties to be infringed upon. National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nipinak said that the powers of Bill C-5 are significant and present substantial risk to many collective rights of First Nations under our own laws, under the Constitution, and under international law. Given the significant concerns of Indigenous peoples and how this legislation can infringe upon their rights, and here's the question, how will the government protect the rights of Indigenous peoples that are recognized and affirmed by Section 35 and uphold the government's obligation to ensure that all laws are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, namely Articles 18, 19, and 32.2?
Mr. Alty.
Thank you. hearing two parts to your question, I'll touch on Nunavut. So Canada does have obligations in modern treaties and self-government agreements, including those in relation to co-management, environmental assessments, consultations, and procurement. Those are legal obligations enshrined on par with the Constitution. So those are continued to respect and be implemented, and this bill can't infringe on those. When it comes to First Nations, that is where the legislation is incentivizing early engagement with Indigenous peoples, and proponents who don't engage with Indigenous peoples before bringing their projects forward for consideration under the legislation would be given a lower evaluation. But to the legal points, it is still that two-part process of Indigenous right holders would be consulted to add a project to Schedule 1, and then once a project is being reviewed, it's also undergoing the consultation process. And I do think I would to zoom out, this bill in the preamble, it's talking about we're looking to urgently advance projects that are in the national interest, including projects, blah, 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 economic trade. Projects that don't have Indigenous support aren't going to urgently advance. We're looking for projects that can get going. To the points and the concerns that Mr. Leblanc has outlined, the Prime Minister has outlined, we are looking with this legislation, we can't put every project under. If every project's a priority, nothing's a priority. If we have too many projects in this pipeline, we're not able to provide the white glove service that we're actually looking to advance these projects. So I do think it's important to remember we're looking to urgently advance, and it really is about those factors, about the high likelihood of successful execution and advancing the interests of Indigenous peoples being that key. I know I have people text me from home being like, I hope I see this project. And I'm like, this isn't a funding pot either. That project that you're talking about has a low likelihood of success because it doesn't have any money. So really making sure we're taking a look at not only with this legislation, but kind of those other pieces too, Indigenous capacity building, Indigenous loan guarantees, et cetera.
Thank you, Minister Alty. The next block goes to the CPC. Senator McCallum and Senator Richards will share their time. Senator McCallum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for taking the time to come and meet with us. These questions are for the come from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And you answered the first one, or I don't know if you answered enough for them. It was about including the Indian Act in Schedule 1. And these are not hypothetical situations or questions. These acts in Schedule 1, when you look at them, as well as some provincial laws, were not enforced, which led to a lack of mitigation. Polluters didn't pay, but taxpayers did, like the orphan wells, and led to concentrated dumping of toxins in First Nation lands and waterways, and resulting in premature morbidity and mortality, hence the passing of the Environmental Racism Act. With the increase in critical minerals mining and the simultaneous increase in toxins, and the fast tracking of major energy, should First Nations expect more of the same and an increase in the toxins that are left at their doorstep?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And I can appreciate where people are coming because to say, trust us, here's the legislation, there's been a lot of broken trust over the years. And from that, I would say is that we know that failing to uphold our legal responsibilities stop projects, delay projects, and we're looking to advance projects. And I know there's lots of questions as well about why isn't consultation defined? And the thing with defining consultation is it's hard to have a single definition for Indigenous consultation. We want to make sure that it's meaningful and it's adequate, and so it's very fact and specific situation. And we've also seen the definition of consultation evolve a lot over history and will continue to evolve, I'm sure. We've seen that coming out of a series of Supreme Court of Canada decisions. So we do want to make sure, rights are affirmed by the Constitution and the duty to consult and accommodate, and so we are committed. And the other point I would make is in the National Major Projects Office is having the Indigenous Advisory Council looking to develop the terms of reference, the composition over the summer with Indigenous rights holders to help provide guidance to make sure that consultation, when it comes to adding a project to Schedule 1, or once we get to setting those conditions, that it's being done right. So, thank you.
Okay, Minister Alty, in your recent public remarks, you stated that First Nations infrastructure is critical, but clarified that it does not fall under the scope of Canada's proposed nation-building legislation, Bill C-5. This bill aims to fast-track major infrastructure projects deemed in the national interest. However, for many First Nations, access to clean water, safe housing, all-season roads, and broadband is not only critical, it is the foundation of nationhood, treaty implementation, and economic self-sufficiency. Can you please clarify how your government justifies excluding First Nations infrastructure from the definition of nation building under Bill C-5, and what message this sends to First Nations who continue to face systemic underinvestment and inequality? How will your government ensure that First Nations are not sidelined once again in decisions about the future of their lands, their economies, and basic human rights?
Thank you for the question and the opportunity to clarify. I'm sure folks here have been misquoted in the media too, and this one is really important to be able to clarify. So with this bill, as noted in the bill's preamble, we're looking to advance projects, the development of economic and trade corridors, connecting different parts of the country to get goods to market, strengthening Canada's ability to trade, and enhancing the development of Canada's natural resources. And then with that, then it's about the evaluation, that 5 parts, strengthening Canada's autonomy, et cetera. So Indigenous proponents, provinces, territories are able to bring any projects that meet those conditions forward for consideration. And the thing I would also say is this bill isn't that magic bullet to solve all the infrastructure deficits that we have in this country. And so it will help some projects that need that regulatory support, but other projects need funding support. It's not a case of regulatory challenges, so really making sure that that we don't rely and put all our eggs into this basket and think our infrastructure deficits are going to go away in this country. This is about addressing the regulatory challenges of mega projects.
Senator Richards.
Thank you very much, and thank you, ministers, for being here. Minister Leblanc, I saw you on TV this morning. Here you are, right in front of me. I am very excited. Very, sir. Very, sir.
TV, because I left Calgary at 5 a.m., so.
Okay. Well, my question is in a similar vein. I really want this bill to go through, and I actually was an opponent to Bill C-69. But yesterday we were visited by the Chief of the Assembly of First Nations as well as Mr. Obed. And the Métis chief from Manitoba, only the Métis chief was hopeful and optimistic about C-5. The Chief of the Assembly of First Nations and Mr. Obed were highly critical because of the feelings of neglect and disrespect to their people. It does seem after all this time no matter how much we want projects to go forward, we might be back at the same impasse, with groups having the exact same concerns. So how might this work against the timely certification of many needed projects if projects are to be challenged by interested groups such as environmental and First Nations by litigation? So how will this differ from Bill 69 and moving projects forward in a timely fashion?
Minister Alty.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. And so there is if this bill gets passed, hopefully it does get passed, then it is engaging with provinces, territories, Indigenous proponents over the summer to solicit projects that meet the criteria of the Act. And projects do need to have done a fair amount of homework. You can't just, boom, I thought of this idea this morning, we should make this a national project. You know, these mega projects need pre-feasibility study, feasibility studies, so you do have to have your homework, a fair amount of your homework done before you come to the federal government and say, I want to add it to Schedule 1. And one of the big things is engaging with impacted First Nations, Inuit, or Métis if the project is in their area. And so, you know, there are a number of mega projects across the country that do have Indigenous proponents who would like to have their project considered under this bill, and we would go through that process. Again, in the second step of this legislation, if a project makes it into Schedule 1, the consultation with impacted Indigenous peoples then goes through to make sure that the conditions are right, the duty to consult as well as accommodate if need be.
Less draconian than Bill C-69.
Mr. Leblanc, you want to take that part?
I'm glad I skated by King Henry VIII. Draconian feels less threatening. Senator Richards, and we've taken note, and I appreciate your comments at the opening of your question. We do think, as I said previously, that there is an important moment where the country can come together, as Rebecca, I think, said, in the right way with respect for constitutional obligations to Indigenous peoples, our environmental protection legislation, but do it in an expedited, thoughtful way that avoids duplication and overlap, and says to investors, as Rebecca properly said, private investors that come forward with these projects, ideally with the participation of Indigenous peoples, the support of provincial and territorial governments. I say governments plural because wouldn't it be great if there's more than one? In many cases, there may be a number. The idea here is to say that for that narrow category of project that will significantly impact the GDP of our country, will deal with trade diversification, opening new markets. My conversation with Premier Smith and Premier Moe last evening was around the discount that we inevitably give to Canadian resources when we have a captive client base. If you have a business where you're selling massively your production or what you're making to one particular client, you probably don't do as well on the price as you would if it's diversified. So all of these factors we think give us an opportunity to do this, but we also recognize, as Rebecca said, that it is for a narrow group of projects thoughtfully identified, and not on a whim, as Rebecca said, without all of the due diligence that would be required in that context. That's the sort of spirit in which we think, Senator Richards, that this is a way to move forward for those projects.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. The Independent Senators Group will be using the next 10 minutes. Senator McBean, followed by Senator Dean, followed by Senator Pate.
Senatrice McBean.
Merci.
Senator McBean, thank you.
Thanks for sharing your 26-hour day with us. I know it's been a busy time. As the government works to identify Schedule 1 projects and build a more ambitious and unified One Canada, sport is a proven and often overlooked tool to help achieve that vision. Major events like Montreal Olympics delivered infrastructure, including the Olympic Stadium, Saint-Claude Robillot, a rowing basin still used by millions annually. The Vancouver 2010 Games led to the completion of the Sea to Sky Highway, the Canada Line, and a new residential community in False Creek, which is home to thousands of Vancouverites, an area that was previously industrial brownland. The Toronto 2015 Pan Am Games brought the UP, the Up Express, and multi-sport facilities in Scarborough, Milton, and Oshawa, many of which continue to serve both high-performance and community athletes. It also led to the development of the West Don Lands neighborhood of Toronto, a neighborhood that includes the WMCA, student residences, and below-market housing, parks, and green spaces that was also industrial brownlands. Investments like these in sport created tens of thousands of jobs, added billions to our GDP. They were Indigenous-led and inspired national pride. They've also left a legacy of accessible facilities that get more kids and families moving, supporting healthier, more active communities at a time when physical inactivity is a growing and public health concern. While other G7 nations are investing and bidding for single and multi-sport international events, Canada risks falling behind and is leaving money and opportunities on the table. Also, provinces and national sport organizations are calling for renewed federal leadership. Our sport infrastructure is dated, and perhaps it's time to have a vision, a new version of 1967's Canadian Centennial projects. Hundreds of pools, arenas, and field houses from coast to coast to coast sounds like something of national significance to me. So my question, does the government recognize sport and activity as more than recreation, but as a national building investment tool that supports physical activity, builds lasting infrastructure, creates jobs, plants a flag firmly in our sovereignty, and inspires the next generation? And how can C-5 be used to support that vision?
Minister.
So, Mr. Chair, through you, Senator, thank you for the question. I absolutely, I think, agree with the premise of the question that, and you used examples that are inspiring that all Canadians, certainly of my generation or older, will remember, of where the country did those big projects in the proper way with those partnerships that Rebecca and your colleagues have referred to, and it has left a lasting economic and social legacy for the country. So I totally subscribe, if I've understood or if I'm properly articulating, I think, the premise of your question. Again, we're back in, I think it would be the fifth time that I'd be in the hypothetical space now. But if 30 minutes left. If Senator, a proponent, and I think Rebecca said something interesting, this is not a federal funding program. It's not the infrastructure program, it's not the infrastructure bank. There are ways that the federal government could partner. If we talk about building a high-speed rail from Quebec City to Windsor, Ontario, therein might be a federal project of national significance, to use a hypothetical example, where the government of Canada would be a funding partner and so on. So this is not about opening up a federal funding stream, but some projects may very well attract federal investment for the reasons you enunciated. If a province or territory with Indigenous partners and municipalities came forward with a proposal for some Olympic Games, for example, therein may lie an opportunity. Again, there's a reason why provinces and municipalities hesitate, because of the cost and the undertaking that represents. But I had not thought of that example, and I appreciate you raising it. Therein may lie an example where proponents, plural, with the right partnerships, may seek to have an expedited process which would give greater certainty to those projects, which is one of the reasons why perhaps many of them haven't been brought forward. So you see the vicious circle.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Dean.
Thank you, Minister. You've been hearing a lot about what my colleagues are worried about. I'm interested in what you have been worrying about. Inevitably, as you work through this legislation with officials over a considerable period of time, you will have identified key success factors and potential failure factors. Could you share one or two of those with us and how you thought about ameliorating them?
Minister.
Senator, that's a good question. I'll take a quick answer, and maybe Rebecca will add something. The success factors would be the execution expeditiously of the project. So studying ad nauseum something that discourages investor confidence and leads to sort of a disinterest from proponents in submitting is obviously one of the challenges we're seeking to address. So the ability to quickly execute a project with all of the partnerships and other elements that my colleague and I have discussed would be for us an example of a successful metric. If Senator Ousakos talked about benchmarking some of this, it will, assuming Parliament adopts this legislation, assuming the premiers and Indigenous partners are as quick as they say they will be in submitting these projects, doing the due diligence that Rebecca talked about, I think it'll become real for Canadians when they see the inspiring examples of real projects going through an evaluation process that is perhaps more effective than it's been in the past. But Rebecca, did you want to add something in terms of examples of a success or a...
I'm a nerd. I love process improvements, and I love looking at stuff from start to finish, from I have an idea to we're cutting the ribbon, and where can we do stuff to accelerate without an impact on the quality. And so because we've been doing stuff sequentially, or the left hand's been doing something and the right hand's been doing something, I think we lose time. So we've take more time and we end up at the same place. So with this, I'm hoping that we'll be able to find those process improvements that are going to benefit just the projects in Schedule 1 for now, but that we'll be able to really make those more substantial improvements to benefit any project, so that it's, if it is the sport center, it will also benefit from this, even if it doesn't happen to make it into Schedule 1. And then I think with my ministerial hat is the work of the major projects, and really working through this gold standard of consultation, and to be able to get that centralized knowledge and tracking of consultation, and just being able to show how we can do it better on to get to the finish line quicker, but without impacting the product along the way.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Pate.
Great. Thank you both for being here, and I'm really excited about what the potential is, but I want to come back to, as others have noticed, Bill C-5 is unlike any other legislation that we've seen and that Parliament has studied. It would allow the Cabinet to greenlight massive resource projects before economic, social, health, environmental, and the possible impacts on Indigenous peoples are considered. And so granting Cabinet the power to ignore laws that are meant to apply to all of us and to protect the health and well-being of Canadians, none of us takes lightly, including I hear from both of you yourselves. Indigenous peoples have already asserted, as you've heard, that giving some 7 days to comment on Bill C-5 does not meet your legal obligations under Section 5 of the UN Declaration Act. And many are predicting that and questioning the logic of rapidly passing a law that could be immediately challenged in court and lead to conflict on the grounds that it will result in greater efficiency and certainty for economic development, and yet obviate the responsibilities of Parliament. So I would like to know from both of you what concrete measures each of you will personally take to ensure your government does not compromise the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, First Nations, Inuit and Métis governance, and environmental commitments.
Ministers.
Yes, thank you. So those rights are enshrined in the Constitution, and this law doesn't supersede it. So I think that's the key thing. And so there is the consultation and accommodation to add a project to Schedule 1. Then there's the consultation and accommodation while developing the conditions for the project. So I think that's the key part. And if the consultation and accommodation during those two parts aren't done right, it does delay the project, which really defeats this bill. But at the end of the day, the Canadian Constitution, the Supreme Court has shown it, there is a requirement, the duty to consult and accommodate, and projects will be required to do that.
Perhaps briefly, Mr. Chair.
Senator, the question with respect to Indigenous rights and the obligation in terms of consultation. Our preference, of course, would be to have Indigenous participation and benefits economically to Indigenous peoples. That would be sort of the gold standard. That's what we're hoping that many of these proponents will suggest. The premise of your question, the approval, assuming there's a designation in Schedule 1, the Major Projects Office works with the proponent. One project, one review. We eliminate the duplication. We would not get to an approval, being the conditions document set out by regulation, for example. We wouldn't get to that approval without having done those environmental assessments in the broad sense of the term. So those will form part of the conditions that will be the approval of the project. Very much informed by the work of Environment and Climate Change Canada, very much informed by the work of Fisheries and Oceans, by scientists, Natural Resources Canada. One particular project some premier talked to me about, there'd be the Nuclear Safety Commission if you're talking about a uranium mine, for example. So all of that work will very much be part of the approval process. I don't want people to think that because there's a designation, that important work mandated by statute is not being done. That would be I think in the law school term is a misapprehension of the facts. So I just want that to be very clear, that in any decision to ultimately grant the approval in the form of conditions, all of that work will be rigorously done. And then the Governor and Council makes a decision that we believe is in the national interest, and it's a cabinet decision, an order in council process with all of the outcomes that would follow a cabinet decision, a Governor and Council decision.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Prosper and Senator Osler from the Canadian Senators Group.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Ministers. My question is for Minister Alty, and it's good to see you again. Earlier, in response to a question from Senator Clement, you provided a number of examples with respect to issues regarding consultations that Indigenous peoples face. And my question focuses around meaningful consultation. It's sort of like the basic requirement here for consultation to be meaningful. And in certain instances, it allows for oral submissions, language considerations, the incorporation of traditional knowledge. It's more than just talking to leadership. It allows First Nations to be well-resourced, given time to digest information, and before it is fed into a process and a decision is made. Do you feel this meaningful consultation can be achieved with compressed timelines within this bill? And if so, how?
Thank you. Thank you for the question and the opportunity to meet the other day. So it does offer me the opportunity to kind of conclude what I was talking about before, but to summarize what I was the Major Projects Office will be leading projects and coordinating the federal decisions, providing that single window for project proponents, coordinating that Crown consultation, and providing that policy, legislative, and regulatory advice. I do think we lose a lot of time, and in my previous role as mayor, I would hear it from from both proponents as well as chiefs of the frustration that a proponent went and engaged with everybody but missed one Indigenous rights holder. So now we're back to the beginning again. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of engagement suffers when we try to have those shorter time frames. It does require the government to invest in resources to create this major projects office right so that we can be effectively engaging. And to your point, because I think you were mentioning some quality engagement protocols in your province. I know in the Northwest Territories we have great co-management and great projects are in the proponents. The traditional knowledge is really valued in closure plans, for example. And one of the things that our office is doing is working with a steering committee, which is made up of Indigenous partners, to develop, hopefully in the coming year, new guidelines for federal officials on consultation and accommodation so that we are getting better and better, and again, using some best practices from across the country, because as you say, it's not just letters. Meaningful consultation is so much more.
Thank you for that. Just and along the lines of meaningful consultation, and although, one can say there's no one definition of consultation, one can look at the best practices and certainly to Supreme Court decisions and incorporate those minimal benchmarks, basic benchmarks for good consultative practices within legislation itself. And this was a prime opportunity to do that. But getting back to the point of what you mentioned, Minister Alty, with respect to the two-step process for consultation, one being the consideration of a project within Schedule 1, and if so, we get into conditions within certain authorizations as providing that mechanism for full consultation with Indigenous rights holders. But my question is this: why not codify basic best practices for consultation, which exists readily throughout within that legislation at the front end, so we can ensure that the narrow timeline this is all facing with the extraordinary powers this bill grants, that it's not on the backs of Indigenous people? Minister.
Yes, and thank you. We didn't go with a single definition because we did, it's very fact and specific situation. And so really looking at the nature of the project, which Section 35 rights holders may be impacted and to what degree, the nature of the Section 35 rights that may be adversely affected, and there's a number of other variables. So, at the end of the day, the Constitution does protect the duty to consult and accommodate. Supreme Court of Canada, they have decisions on this. And we will be working with the major national projects office as well as the Indigenous Advisory Council to ensure that the consultation is meaningful and robust. And again, hoping to be able to replicate that, to share that knowledge so that it's not just the projects in Schedule 1 that are going through great consultation, but we're seeing that throughout the country.
Senator Hustler.
Thank you. And thank you, ministers, both of you, for being here today. My question's for Minister Alty, and it's actually a question about consultation, and it's the same question I asked yesterday to our Indigenous panel. Because one of the potential issues around the concept of consultation is what defines an impacted community. For instance, if there are concerns around impacts to migratory herds, such as caribou, or disruption of the summer habitat of beluga whales, the term impacted communities should include communities beyond those that would be traditionally chosen for consultation. And if you look at my home province of Manitoba, Churchill, the port has been identified as a potential nation-building project. And given Churchill's location and proximity to Nunavut, one could say that the Inuit, as well as the Dene, should be consulted. So as Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, how will the government determine
who should be consulted and who should be considered an impacted community?
Minister?
I don't have the exact information, so I will come back to you on that because it's not us just deciding today it's this group, tomorrow it's that. There is more robust process involved. So I will get staff to get back to yourself as well as the rest of the senators with a more fulsome answer.
Thank you, Minister. And I think, more importantly, having that answer for the communities, for the rights holders is far more important than getting it back to us. But thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Cardozo and Senator Kozner from the Progressive Senators Group. You have 10 minutes. Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, ministers. My question is about labor mobility, recognition of workers' credentials. So are you expecting to have more mutual recognition between provinces of credentials, or do you see standardization of certification happening? And I ask that in the context of this is a federal law. Are there limitations about what you can do? And is this more symbolic and you're just trying to set the table for what you expect the provinces to do, if I can use the Prime Minister's term, catalyze action in this area?
Minister?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Senator Cardozo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Our question is a good one. Nothing in this legislation impacts the jurisdiction of provinces and territories. I think that's also a fundamental thing that ça va sans le dire, but we should say
it goes without saying.
Ambiguity in that regard. And the example you properly used, and I know you've studied this issue yourself in a policy context, the mutual recognition in many of the examples that Canadians think about is properly in the hands of provinces and territories. So, and I know, not to duck, but in her fulsome answers yesterday, I'm sure that my colleague, Chrystia Freeland, who has the carriage of the responsibility, not to duck the question, I'm happy to answer it, but she has been drilling down with provinces and territories on this issue of mutual recognition. We wanted to start by bringing the Government of Canada to the conversation with the cleanest hands we can. So we had, for example, the Deputy Clerk and I, before we came here, were talking about, if you're a land surveyor in the province of New Brunswick, and you were doing, this may have been, Chrystia used this example yesterday, so Chris Fox is cheating, giving it to two of us. But there are examples where the Government of Canada had regulatory requirements that don't make sense and were in fact barriers to that labor mobility. If a land surveyor in our province of New Brunswick is working on a military base or doing a project under federal jurisdiction, if they're a certified land surveyor in Nova Scotia, I'd be quite happy to see them working on a project in Manitoba. And there are other examples. We're trying to, I want to be careful because it's not at all, in a patronizing way, the Government of Canada is not playing big brother to the provinces. The provinces are leading themselves by example in this area. And the provinces are sort of coming together, one with the other, and in small regional groups, and saying, hey, we're prepared right away. The province of Alberta has been a leader in this space. Former Premier Jason Kenney was doing great work. Premier Palliser of Manitoba. Some premiers, former premiers, have been leading this conversation. Premier of Nova Scotia has been a great leader in this regard. In terms of saying to their other First Minister colleagues, how can we collectively do that work? And the Government of Canada wants to enable it in the sense we don't have federal barriers. Catalyze is a good word, but I'm encouraged by their desire to do that work themselves in a very effective way.
Can I ask, since you're also the lead minister in terms of Canada-U.S. relations, do you see this act as being something where you're sort of arming ourselves against the United States, or is it sort of separate because of the tariff threats? We're getting our house in order in a different way because we can't trust working with them anymore?
Yeah, you've used big arming ourselves against the United States is not the phrase I would have used. You used that word, Senator. But I take your point entirely. We think that this legislation is part of Canada's response to the economic uncertainty created by President Trump's tariffs. It's having a direct, I exchanged messages with Premier Ford today. Imagine what it means for the steel industry in his province and right across the country. That economic uncertainty is affecting workers and businesses in an acute way every day, and in some sectors it's getting worse day over day. So this is part of a united Canada's response to giving ourselves the economic instruments to grow our economy, diversify our trade, and inspire Canadians to build big nation projects in the national interest. So it's part of an answer, but Canadians are coming up with all kinds of very inspiring ways of how we can meet the challenge of an unreliable trading partner with the United States. This is our government's clearly stated objective in the election campaign as part of the response. But we continue to look at other ways that we can make the economy more resilient. I wouldn't want to cut off Senator Kuzner's time, Mr. Chair. I know everybody's been looking forward to that, so I'll stop speaking now and we'll let Roger have a run here.
Senator Kuzner.
Nice to see you, both senators. Not as much Senator LeBlanc. Senator LeBlanc, I just can't get over how much you enjoy coming to this chamber. Minister, one thing about mobility, and coming off my colleagues' questions about credentialing and the recognition of interprovincial credentials, the big challenge is going to be in mobility. I think one of the challenges is going to be the cost. We know that with the drop in the price of oil, that many of the companies in the West, who for a long time relied on Atlantic Canadian labor and Central Canadian labor, those opportunities have sort of ceased. Your government, your past government, did recognize this and put in some provisions for tax incentives for mobility. Do you see continuing on in that line? Because we want to match job opportunities with people that have those skills. So do you see this being expanded on in light of this challenge you have?
Senator, your question is bang on, and the part of the country you represent, like mine, we see at the airports, if it's Halifax or Moncton, we see many hardworking women and men going to other parts of the country to earn good wages in sectors of the economy that then end up driving the regional economies in our part of the country. So I've said before, every Canadian should be interested in the success. I said this to Premier Smith last night. The resource economies of the country create employment in every part of the country and add economic value. But you're right, for a bunch of reasons, global markets, other factors, there are some challenges. So one of the things, a tax credit to incentivize that labor mobility, I think it was an idea that started our conservative colleagues in the other place, had been proposing a series of measures around tools for tradespeople, labor mobility. I think there's a lot of merit, in my own view, in those ideas. I know the Minister of Finance is looking at ways to help, working with unions and representatives of many of these workers. How can we have fiscal instruments that would encourage and support that mobility? And to your colleague's question, Senator, earlier, also incentivize some of the training opportunities that would exist. And the provinces have obviously a critical role to play on the training side, but we want to be a partner for them as well.
Thank you very much. Canada, we've seen in this country sporadic attempts at breaking down interprovincial barriers in the past. The actions by the current president have really galvanized Canadians, and there seems to be everybody sees that it's imperative now. You've been up close and personal with you understand the spontaneity of this current president. Should we land a deal? Should we get a trade deal with them? Do you think that you take the foot off the gas pedal? Do you think that is that degree of urgency that the government has right now, will that continue even if we do land a trade deal with the U.S.?
So, Mr. Chair, through you, Senator, thank you for the question. The short answer is no. The importance of giving ourselves the ability to properly but expeditiously work with partners to approve projects in the national interest, I think will exist whether or not we're successful in getting a trade deal with the United States. You saw yesterday, and I was in that meeting yesterday morning in Kananaskis with the Prime Minister and the President. They have given us, again, a mandate with a shortened up to, hopefully less than 30 days, to see if we can hammer out the remaining elements of that deal. But the economic uncertainty won't be lifted if we're successful. And if we're not successful, then we really have to double down on ways to support workers and businesses and sectors in our economy. Imagine for steel producers, if we're building big national projects, there's an opportunity therein immediately for some of the great workers and businesses that produce some of Canada's steel. So that's just one example amongst many. And the other thing, Senator Kuzner, which I think is instructive, is there is built into the CUSMA, Canada, United States, Mexico trade agreement, a review in 2026. To your point about the unpredictability of the American administration, President Trump will be the American president when that review comes up. I spoke to the Mexican economy minister yesterday about how we can work with our partners in Mexico when that review ultimately comes upon us. So that uncertainty, sadly, will not dissipate if we get, as we hope we can in the short term, a deal. There still is, I think, the urgency of giving ourselves the right instruments to build big nation building projects again.
Thank you, Minister.
The next block goes to the Independent Senators Group, Senator Beam, Senator Miville-Deschênes, and Senator Dusko. Senator Beam.
Ministers, I'm over here. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. Time is short. I've got two quick questions I'd like to ask Minister Leblanc. And the first is in developing Bill C-5, the Building Canada Act in particular, did the government take on any analysis in terms of similar nation-building initiatives that may have taken place in other countries around the world? I'm thinking in particular of Germany after the wall came down. That was a pretty big nation-building experiment and project that is still going on. Or countries like similar to ours that are federations like Australia. So that's the one. And you mentioned you were talking to a lot of people at Kananaskis, and you can do that sort of thing at summits. My second question, and I'll put it straightforwardly. In a lot of my travels around the world, I've looked at projects that have been built, and it turns out that much of the investment came from Canadian pension funds. Is the government looking at drawing in Canadian pension funds as partners in these projects that you're going to approve?
Minister Leblanc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Senator Beam.
Thank you, Chair.
Two excellent questions. Your experience in those summit contexts, I thought of you yesterday when our old friend Peter McGovern was in Calgary. He and I spoke of the work that you and he and I had done in previous iterations around some of those summits. And you're absolutely right. There is an opportunity to talk to partners. The Australian ambassador to the United States currently is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Rudd. He asked me about this legislation. He had taken note of, and you're right, we have to, if we're looking to examples, you named two, Senator, Germany and Australia, we have to look to federations. It's different in a unitary state. The barriers, the regulatory or approval barriers would be necessarily different. The two examples you used are very good. The former Prime Minister, Ambassador Rudd, now talked to me about how in different parts of different states in Australia, the national government had sought to incentivize these projects, including with Indigenous proponents. So I was inspired by his interest in knowledge of our circumstance and the comparators. And I know our colleagues at the Privy Council office working with the Foreign Affairs Department are exactly looking at examples of other federations in the two countries you mentioned, Senator. I know are places where the Privy Council is interested in looking for best practices. And the other part of your question, Senator, our view has always been the best way to incentivize these kind of projects is to look at private capital and to see how private investors are able to work in different regulatory contexts to identify opportunities and make those investments with greater certainty. So we're going to be drawing in a series of partnerships that in our view will give Canada an opportunity we haven't had previously.
Thank you. Sénatrice Miville-Deschênes.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Senator Miville-Deschênes, thank you. Welcome, ministers. You speak a great deal, Mr. Leblanc, about projects that will inspire Canadians. And among them, there's been much talk of pipelines to transport Canadian oil, a major source of pollution due to greenhouse gas emissions. Can we truly be talking, are we truly talking about projects for the 21st century, for the future, when we're thinking of our children, forest fires, and the future of the planet? My question is, of course, more philosophical, but I have a feeling that we're going backwards. It's 2025. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Senator. You are right when you say that we often speak of projects such as pipelines. I have said that to journalists several times in public, on air, and the Saskatoon meeting with the premiers of provinces and territories, well, I'd say about 5% of the conversation concerned oil pipelines. I found it inspiring when the Quebec Premier talked about his joint project with the Newfoundland Premier to develop the second green energy project in Churchill, Labrador. I found it inspiring when the Manitoba Premier talked about diversifying our exports with the mayor of Churchill. We have the impression that it's one single sector and one type of project that defines the urgency for action. But when a Nova Scotia Conservative Premier talks to us about wind energy projects in the sea and how they can be connected to the Atlantic grid, but what about green projects in opposition to fossil fuel ones? When I listed the 5 criteria for your colleagues that will help us decide whether to designate a project as in national interest, one of them is Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. That's in the law. Investors themselves, and I meet private businesses that are suggesting clean energy projects, hydrogen and other. These are business people who come to us with inspiring projects that are supported by their provinces and territories. The project in Grace Bay in Nunavut to open up Canada's Arctic sovereignty. This is a proposal brought to us by Inuit proponents. But you are right, we cannot forget that the majority of projects, and we'll see when they're tabled, there should be a good mix of projects, but you're right that they shouldn't simply be defined by one industry, and thank you for speaking through the eyes of your chair.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, ministers. I'm over here. As you have articulated earlier today, and as we see in the bill, Part 2 of the bill sets out the factors that the government may consider when determining whether a project is in the national interest and will be included in the fast-track process. Now, it seems pretty clear to me that there's going to be competition for projects to be chosen. There will be projects and their backers will be hoping to be on the list and to be picked. Therefore, given that there will be a competition, the government needs a rigorous and fair and transparent process for choosing the projects. I want to drill down a little bit. Can you be more specific on how the criteria that you've identified, the 5 criteria, will be applied? Are they given equal weight in the consideration of projects? Are some criteria more important than others, for example? What is the process? Is it possible for a project, for example, to be strongly related to economic growth, but let's say not so good on another criteria? For example, having clean growth potential. Perhaps there's a project that can spur growth, but it's not very good for clean energy or for clean potential. So I want to get a sense of how you're going to deal with the process, because of course Canadians will want a process that is fair and transparent when you are choosing projects.
Vous avez à peu près une minute pour répondre.
You have about 1 minute to respond.
Monsieur, madame.
Alors, je serai très vite.
I'll be very fast then.
Senatrice, your question, the challenge is to identify, I enumerated them, I won't reread them, are the factors that the government will consider when deciding whether we make that designation, as Rebecca described that process. It's hard to do it in the absence of a specific set of facts. So back to, this will be the 6th time, Mr. Chair, back to the hypothetical. When we see a province or territory, an Indigenous organization come forward with a project, the government will use the 5 criteria enumerated in the law, if the law is adopted by Parliament. And this is not going to be done in a steakhouse at night, in some restaurant. Like, you're going to have premiers, you're going to have Indigenous leaders, you're going to have, and you're right, there is a healthy competition. The premiers are talking to each other and to us about ideas they have, and one thing about a group of politicians that get together, it's not often done quietly. So there is a merit, in our view, of having these premiers, Indigenous partners, use examples. But at the end of the day, there has to be a proponent, and there has to be an amount of money that private investors, public investors are prepared to put forward. One of the reasons we want to do this is to incentivize that very investment. And then you're going to see, I hope, to your colleague's question, a series of inspiring examples in different sectors, some of which people perhaps aren't thinking of when they look at this particular project, this particular bill right now.
Thank you, Minister. The last block, Senatrice Martin and Senator Seidman, you have the floor. Senator Martin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, ministers. My questions are for Minister Alty. Bill C-5 proposes an Indigenous Advisory Council within the Federal Major Projects Office. Yesterday, the Indigenous leaders in this chamber said they did not know any details about the the makeup and the process to form the Indigenous Advisory Council. So can you provide some details on how the members of this council will be selected to ensure balanced representation of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis voices? And additionally, what formal mechanisms will be in place to ensure the council's advice carries real weight in project decision-making rather than being a checkmark in the process?
Yes, and thank you for the question. So there's not only this bill, but standing up that National Major Projects Office, as well as the capacity funding for Indigenous rights holders, as well as the Indigenous loan guarantee. So there's a lot of moving parts all at once. And so the Indigenous Advisory Council, the terms of reference will be drafted, and so we're not presupposing what the composition would look like, but looking to develop that over the summer with it getting up in the fall. And then to the how the council will engage with the Major Projects Office. Did you want to speak a little bit about that, Dominic?
So, Rebecca, thank you. And the question is a good one, and perhaps it picks up on Senator Husakos' initial question. The Federal Major Projects Office is designed to be a small group of experts in supply chains, trade, diversification, Indigenous consultation, equity experts, Arctic and Northern expertise. So imagine, and many of those people will be taken, it's not creating a big new bureaucracy. The idea is to take many of that expertise from existing departments, supplement it where necessary. And the Indigenous Advisory Group will be a key part of that evaluation. I saw some public commentary around whether the Prime Minister this summer would meet with Indigenous leaders before, as to Rebecca's point, that council is stood up. He's made that commitment. The Prime Minister himself will be having those series of meetings with rights holders and Indigenous organizations precisely to ensure that those decisions reflect the desire to collaborate that we have, but integrate that work in the real decision-making and advice that would come to me and that I would then give to my cabinet colleagues.
Okay, we still don't know the details, but that was a very burning question and a desire for the leaders to understand what that will look like. So given that the council's input may influence projects deemed to be in the national interest, will the government commit to making the council's recommendations and rationale publicly available to ensure transparency and demonstrate how Indigenous perspectives directly inform project outcomes?
Yeah, and I think I'd just clarify too an important part. The Indigenous Advisory Council isn't an Indigenous rights holder. So when we are talking about consultation to add a project to Schedule 1, or we're talking about consultation on a project to set conditions, that consultation, the legal requirement would be with the rights holder impacted there. The Indigenous Advisory Council would be that higher level, providing recommendations to the National Major Projects Office. So just making sure that there's a distinction there.
Do I have any more time?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I have one more in relation to the projects themselves. Given the emphasis of Bill C-5 on advancing projects of national interest, how will your government ensure that Indigenous-led resource and infrastructure projects, like those already mired in federal regulatory delays, are prioritized and supported through this streamlined process? Especially when some already meet the government's criteria for economic benefits and likelihood of execution.
Yeah, I think that's, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Projects that are coming forward have done a lot of, projects that will be coming forward have done a lot of that homework already. The engagement with impacted Indigenous rights holders. And then some of these are actually have Indigenous equity in those projects. And so that would score better. That is more favorable. We are looking for those projects that can hit the ground running. And so if you can show that you have Indigenous support of the project, that it does have that Indigenous equity, it does come to the top more than a project that doesn't have support of the local communities, doesn't have the Indigenous support, still has to do a lot of that homework. Again, this legislation is also time limited with that 5-year. We're looking to get these projects, recognizing the challenges that the country's facing, the steel, aluminum, tariffs. We do want to get these projects going sooner rather than later, and projects that have that support would come up higher.
Senator Seidman, you have the floor for the last questions.
Thank you. Thank you, ministers, for being with us. My question is for you, Minister Leblanc. It states that the purpose of the Act is to promote free trade and labour mobility within Canada while continuing to protect the health and safety of Canadians. So the Canadian Cancer Society has cautioned that Bill C-5 could unintentionally weaken public health and safety protections by enabling less stringent provincial health standards to become the default if the federal standards are removed in certain cases. Is there a safeguard in this bill to ensure that this does not happen?
So, if I may, Mr. Chair, your question, Senator, is a good one in the sense that if we're talking about either coming to cooperation agreements with provinces and territories in terms of reviewing projects, or in the case of labor standards, which would be the first part of the legislation, the idea is absolutely not to drive it to the lowest common denominator, but to be inspired by best practices and to avoid duplication and overlap. So that is wherein lies the authority to come to cooperation agreements with provinces and territories around approvals and review processes. But I certainly share your view that Canadians would not be forgiving of governments, federal or provincial and territorial, that would seek to, and to use your example, undermine health and safety essential to the fight against cancer. That was the example you used, one that obviously of which I have a keen personal interest. But there are other examples in other sectors where I think governments can be inspired by best practices, can avoid delay and overlap and duplication while maintaining the same high standards that Canadians would rightfully expect.
Thank you. Does the bill allow for a specific exemption for health through regulations after the bill is passed, for example?
Allow for
a specific exemption for health through regulations?
For health through regulations?
Through health, a specific exemption for health issues using the regulations after the bill is passed.
Health issues, give me an example, Senator.
Okay, I will. So for
example, of a health issue.
Well, for example, the Canadian Cancer Society talked about asbestos. So asbestos is absolutely not permitted by Canadian standards and regulations, but there are provinces that still permit a certain amount of asbestos in buildings. That's an example that's been used.
So again, that's a good example. I'm not the right scientific expert in terms of what those standards would be, but as the minister who would oversee the process by which we would sign either cooperation agreements with provinces and territories, and certainly I know my colleague Chrystia Freeland, who would have the carriage of the responsibility around standards. Again, I understand the concern, but it is in the extreme hypothetical to say the Government of Canada would seek to weaken standards that would protect people from potential cancer-causing circumstances like that. I understand the concern, but our objective will be to be inspired by some of the best practices that different jurisdictions are using, and to find a way that we can have a common high standard in terms of protecting Canadians, not allow this to become a way to reduce the standard across the country. That would be an outcome that would be absolutely unacceptable to us.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Ministers.
Has been hearing from the ministers for 130 minutes. In conformity with the order adopted by the Senate, I'm obliged to interrupt proceedings in order to proceed with the second panel. Madame la Ministre Alti, Monsieur le Ministre Leblanc.
Minister Alty, Minister Leblanc, on behalf of all senators, I thank you for joining us today and for assisting us with our work. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Honorable Senators, we will suspend very briefly to prepare for the second panel. Thank you. Merci.